We're living our truth now. Krista, what?
Krista who?
Christadelphian?
Did you say Christian Dolphin? So are you from Philadelphia?
Welcome to the Life After Leaving podcast, an ex-Christadelphian podcast.
Hey everyone, I just wanted to let you know that we did have some technical difficulties with the microphone while recording this episode, so you may notice some background noise before we changed microphones and that the audio quality is a little different after that. Also, before we begin, please note that today's episode mentions some difficult topics, including domestic violence, child abuse, pedophilia, incest, and violent murder. We recognize that these topics may be triggering for some people. You may want to skip over some sections of this podcast or skip this episode if this would cause you distress to hear about these situations. Thank you. Welcome back to the show, heathens. I'm your host, Zinnia, and today I'm joined by Keturah. Thank you for joining me on this episode.
Thanks for having me, Zinnia.
Yes, thanks for coming back on for your second episode, which we did tease a little bit earlier. So today we have a very exciting episode for any true crime fans in our audience as we talk about the most notorious Christadelphians and some of the strangest stories of crime to come out of the community. I personally didn't know any of these when I was a member of the Christadelphians, so it was at times fascinating and at other times deeply disturbing to learn about these real stories of criminal behavior among the Christadelphians. So as always, feel free to check out our show notes to take a look at our sources mentioned during this episode. So Keturah, I'm going to share some stories and tell you about them, and you can feel free to chat and react as we go. Sound good?
Good. Thanks.
All right, so we're going to start with our first story. So originally I found 3 Christadelphians to talk about, but then you shared another incident which I hadn't known about, and then I decided to add one story because this episode felt like a good time to talk about something I came across when I was reading Christadelphian history books. So we'll be going through the 5 most notorious Christadelphians today that I know of.
All right, I'm ready.
Okay. This first one is the most speculative because it was a long time ago, and the documentation records this person was associated with some people doing criminal activity rather than specifically documenting them doing the criminal activity themselves. Do you have any guesses about who this first one is going to be about?
I have no idea.
It's John Thomas.
All right. We're getting right into it.
We're going right for the throw off the get-go. All right.
Yeah, let's go for that profit. Not really a profit, but
but the founder. Oh, he would be so mad. But to be
I know,
fair,
right?
He's so vain. He'd also be proud and be like, "Oh yeah."
I think he kind of would. Yeah.
And I'll tell you why as we get into a little more.
Okay.
So for anyone listening who doesn't know who he is, because they're like, ooh, true crime, I'm going to start here instead of, in the beginning. John Thomas is the founder of the Christadelphians, and I did introduce him and give him a backstory in episode 2. So if you're lost or confused, I recommend you pop back to that episode. So for everyone else and all of our ex-Christadelphians who have heard his name a million times, let me tell you about John Thomas's story. As we know, John Thomas was a doctor and was usually referred to as such. And if you remember from the history episode, we mentioned how in the 1800s, medicine wasn't really regulated. In fact, there was one component of the medical industry that specifically wasn't well regulated that I want to tell you about. And that was supplying cadavers or dead bodies for medical classrooms. And as we know from the history episode, Roberts wrote in Thomas's biography that Thomas proudly mentioned that he was spending time among dead bodies. So our question today is, where did those dead bodies come from? Our story begins when Dr. John Thomas moved his family to Illinois. Like his father, he moved around a lot. So by this time, he had already spent time in Ohio, Virginia, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. And after a very brief stint of farming in Illinois, he gave that up and founded the first religious newspaper in St. Charles, Illinois. For anyone who wants to know, it's called the St. Charles Patriot and Fox River Herald. They liked things to be very wordy. So the first medical school in Illinois was also founded right around that time, and it was called the Franklin Medical College. So John Thomas is actually recorded as being the president and lecturer for the chemistry department at this medical college. And it's funny because it was located on the second floor of a building on the northeast corner of Main Street and First Avenue, which is home to Riverside Pizza and Pub for anyone from St. Charles, Illinois. And what's funny is when Hemingway writes that Dr. Thomas was working in the second story of a building on the east side of the river near the northwest corner of Main and First. So I guess he was working like right there in the newspaper industry too. They were really close to each other, but I'm not from St. Charles, Illinois, so I don't know exactly how that works out to today. So Don Thomas was working for a man named Dr. George Richard, and he founded the college. So Dr. Richards was also the instructor for anatomy and surgery. So to teach anatomy and surgery, the students needed bodies to practice on. So where did we think Dr. Richards got the bodies from?
Oh, God.
Where do we think?
Oh, my God.
Not a lot of good options in the 1800s now that you think about it.
Now,
Cemeteries.
you did just say he moved his family there. Were they alive when he moved them?
I can confirm they were alive. Because that is the other question is like, are we making dead bodies? We finding dead bodies. There is a difference there. Yep. Good point.
Yeah, good point.
So rather than murdering them, they were getting them from cemeteries.
Oh, man. Wow.
So the school developed a reputation for inciting a sudden interest in grave robbing.
Oh, my God.
Coincidentally started right around the town of St. Charles and was moving further away to towns nearby in Illinois. So a term was actually coined for grave robbers, and because they took people out of the grave, they were called resurrectionists. And that just tickled me as a phrase. As a former Christadelphian, you grow up hearing about the resurrection, and now I'm like, oh, the resurrection is these people grabbing my dead body and like hauling it out onto a wagon. Yeah, but yeah, so this is where we're at. So the sudden increase in grave robbings related to the school became so notorious that both Roberts and Hemingway mention it in their early histories of Dr. Thomas. So these are the two books I referenced significantly in that episode too. So this is the first place I heard about it. This is like, all right, let's look into it some more. So Peter Hemingway wrote in his book, John Thomas, His Friends and His Faith, on page 92, that Dr. Richards was, quote, notorious in the annals of St. Charles for his involvement in grave robbing, unquote, which is a polite way to introduce what's coming and minimize the relationship with Thomas. So meanwhile, in Thomas's biography, Robert Roberts records an incident that would have been around 1842 when Thomas was writing that local religious paper. In the official biography, Dr. Thomas, His Life and His Work, Roberts records that, quote, Dr. Richards provided bodies for dissection through the enterprise of his pupils. On one occasion, a body was missed from a neighboring cemetery, and suspicion was at once fixed upon the college students. The incident created quite a sensation. The doctor, in his capacity of purveyor of, reported the circumstance in his paper, and strove to allay the excitement by remarking upon the necessity of dissection to the qualifications of surgeons, and the groundlessness of the alarm which prevailed. This was construed as identifying the paper and its editor with the sacrilege, as it was then called, which had been committed, and the doctor became exceedingly unpopular. The excitement, however, died away, and the matter was forgotten. Some years afterwards, however, in the same town, after the doctor had left it, on the occasion of a similar case, a mob attacked the residence of Dr. Richards. And maybe I'll stop there so I can tell you the rest, because I'm going to tell you the full story. So Dr. Thomas was already here at the beginning when this issue was starting to be an issue, but it did escalate after he left. And that's literally recorded in his biography. So the fact that there's a gunfight was something I was not expecting in the origin of the Christadelphians in their history book. So I also wish that Roberts was a little bit clearer in his sentence structure, because he's like, oh, Dr. Thomas was a purveyor of, and I was like, of dead bodies or just a newspaper? Because usually that means physical goods, but it's unclear just from the way he said it. So it's like, it's a little weird. Okay, suspicious. So maybe it's just he was the bearer of bad news. Maybe. It's also interesting that Dr. Thomas took a public stance in this religious newspaper on this scandal to amplify his opinion that this was justified behavior, and it makes me wonder if he had any personal history in this sort of activity. Thomas also claimed that it was groundless, which feels like lying and gaslighting since it was later confirmed that the students were in fact resurrectionists that were stealing bodies from graves. So like that's another example of just a blatant lie from John Thomas. I actually watched a YouTube video that was really good on this of a guy walking around St. Charles talking about this and showing the different scenes. And he actually includes a photo of 1800s medical students doing a dissection, and it's pretty horrifying. So if anyone wanted to see that, I'll link the YouTube video. And it's just one quick bit of the YouTube video. But seeing it, I was like, yeah, I don't think I'd want them doing that to my body. And like all these men standing there, like pulling the skin off. It was gross. So people weren't a big fan of people stealing their family members and like, doing this to them. So, yeah, you know,
that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. I see where they're coming from. These communities that did not ask for this medical school. So after John Thomas failed at farming and became an unpopular religious newspaperman, Thomas left St. Charles only a few years after he'd been there. So he left town by the time shit hit the fan in 1849. So this is the incident that it was leading up to in his biography that went down in history as Richard's Riot. So even though he was only there for a brief time, I'm going to just tell you the full story of what was mentioned in the short version in his biography. And if it was in the biography, it means it was important enough that John Thomas himself told Robert Roberts about it, who then recorded it in the biography. Did not include how he met his wife or anything, or about the birth of his first daughter, but he did include this. So let me tell you.
Women aren't important.
This is what we're including. So in April 1849, 16-year-old Marilla Kenyon died of cholera, and the local grave robbers got wind of it. So a student named John Rood, and it's spelled R-O-O-D, but basically R-U-D-E also applies.
Yeah.
He went with Dr. Richards' son, so George Richards Jr., to dig up her body from Ohio Grove Cemetery outside the town of Sycamore and bring it back to the school for dissection. Some sources say that this student, John, was actually known for being poor and was paying for his tuition by selling bodies to the school, but that wasn't confirmed across multiple sources. So John and George and maybe a third person took a one-horse wagon down to the cemetery and dug her up. However, your face. By this time, the students in the medical college had a reputation. Obviously, even in like 1842 when John Thomas was there, it was already making the papers. And that was when John Thomas tried to kind of help cover it up in his publications. But these rumors were causing people to keep an eye on cemeteries and checking the graves for signs that the bodies had been removed. So the family discovered that the comb she had been buried with was close to the surface of the grave. So they went and dug for the coffin. They discovered the lid was broken and her burial clothes were inside, but the body was gone. So apparently the clothes were just not used by the resurrectionists, so they would just undress them and literally steal the body. So everyone basically knew who was responsible when a body went missing from the graveyard. So they went to the school to confront Dr. Richards. And he's like, what body? I've never even heard of her. She's not in our freezer. So the accounts generally say that they were looking for her at the school and they didn't find her body. But some say that they found a lock of her hair at the school. And so there were suspicions that they were tipped off and hid her body somewhere. So the family is very concerned, trying to find her body. And apparently it was very high stakes because they were worried about her remains, because apparently after they would dissect them, they would just throw them in the Fox River. Like they wouldn't return them, they wouldn't bury them, they wouldn't give them back to the family. Like there was no procedures in place. And so it was really dishonorable. Like people would just be throwing your body parts down the river, which I also imagine is traumatizing for people walking along the river who see dead bodies washing up. Again, this medical school had a reputation. So the family left. They come back with a large group of people. Estimates range from 40 people to 300 people, and they were armed. So they show up at Richard's house, and they decide they're going to search the house, which I guess he was keeping dead bodies there. And they apparently found dead body parts in some accounts. So, I mean, a good place to look, apparently, if that's what he has there. So it's recorded that the new husband of the 16-year-old girl who died, I guess she had just gotten married, stuck his rifle against the door and shot through the door. There's a little bit of dispute about who fired first. Again, this is an old story, but he definitely fired into the house. And until recently, there were still bullet holes in the door and the building that you could see. So the bullets hit Dr. Richards and the guy who dug up the girl, John Rood. John was hit in the hips and died in the following few weeks from the injury. Dr. Richards was shot in the shoulder joint, which paralyzed his right arm, went into his lung, And someone also threw a little like stone at his face. So he got like the mob was throwing rocks at him. So there's a few different accounts of how it ended. Some said they like threatened, "We'll kill you if you don't give her back." Some said they had a mediator. Some said they thought they were dead, and so they left because they were like, "We're done here." But no one was arrested. It was just mob violence.
Yeah.
And now it's a pizza parlor at this medical school.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it's crazy. That's why the YouTube video is so funny. He's like, "Here's the pizza parlor where it all started."
Oh.
Yeah, it's wild to have history competing with the modern day and just see them side by side. It's wild. So there's a fun component that's Roberts actually omitted from his story and Thomas's biography. But some sources say that a psychic and spiritualist in town named Mrs. Caroline Howard is said to have helped the family locate the body. Carolyn was helping run the Howard House Hotel on 3rd Street and Illinois Street with her family. She's also the medium that was hired by Mary Todd Lincoln after President Abraham Lincoln died because the wife wanted to contact him on the other side. So some say, oh, he just admitted where the body was. You know, he got a rock to the face that taught him to, you know, tell us where it was. But some say that it was a medium. And it's interesting because the Howard House Hotel still exists today and is known as the place where she gave her seances. So if you believe in that, it's possible that version is what happened. But either way, they found the body at the edge of the riverbank in a shallow grave. It looked like they were dumping bodies like 2 miles from the school. So it seemed like it was kind of in that area where they were doing their activities. They just like dug a shallow grave to store the body. So to bring it back to the Christadelphians, Peter Hammond pointed out at the time it was the student's responsibility to produce a cadaver to work on. So grave robbing really was the best option since laws and organizations weren't really in place. Hemingway wrote that, quote, "No cadavers, medical student there with no organized or legal supply of cadavers, medical students were at that time forced to desperate measures to obtain bodies for dissection. Dr. Thomas clearly was no stranger to the problem itself either," unquote. Which again is like, how acquainted was he with this problem?
That's so strange. How I don't understand enough about the grave robbing and what was going on. It makes sense, I guess, if there's no laws, that it was really difficult and you wanted to learn.
That's the tricky thing.
I get that. How did he get over resurrecting people and based, you know, against his faith? How does that work?
Well, I found an article where he talks a little bit about it. So that's where we're actually going to dive into just a little bit to see kind of where he was and where the policies were also at the time. Although it kind of goes cross country now because you have this very new country in America and he was leaving from England. So you also have this other society there and their laws, which is where he was writing this. But it said that Hemingway actually had found this article written by Dr. Thomas in 1829. So it was a year after he graduated from that 2-year medical program at St. Thomas's Hospital that he quoted. But what's weird about it is he doesn't sign the article Dr. Thomas. He signed it Mr. Thomas. And I was like, aren't you a doctor now? So that was a little suspicious. I don't know why that is, if that's normal or not. I don't know. But he wrote in support of a bill called the Anatomy Bill, and it was to create a new source of bodies for medical students. So it would require that all persons dying in prisons, hospitals, or workhouses, if not claimed within 72 hours, are to be given up to licensed teachers. So basically, before they were just getting criminals who died, but this way, if someone died who was, you know, didn't have family around to claim the body, that body would then go to medical students. So it also put into place laws requiring schools to be licensed, which seems pretty valid, and to bury the remains of their subjects, to be more respectful. So people were saying there's a lot of problem with the resurrectionists. So I was able to get a copy of this article and actually see John Thomas's full opinions on it. So he talked about that providing bodies, it would cause the, quote, abolition of the resurrectionists, the more plentiful supply of subjects for the purpose of dissection, unquote. And he was talking about the lack of legal means to get a cadaver was an issue. He wasn't thrilled with the prospect of returning bodies to their graves, though. He wrote that, quote, "By some it is thought that dissection as a punishment for a crime should be abolished, but the framer of this bill appears to me have thought otherwise, as they require that bodies be decently buried after dissection," unquote. It's like, okay, so Thomas remarked that this, quote, "cannot be exceedingly inconvenienced the anatomical lecturer. I see no reason why his convenience should be sacrificed to superstitious feeling," unquote. So he just wanted like this commission who was making these laws to take care of the arrangements if that's what has to be done. But he was not a fan of it. He's like, I don't want more work for me. I want to just, dissect people and throw them in the river.
Oh my God.
So
Wow.
it was kind of sad to see that he felt that being respectful to people who had died was kind of a superstitious feeling. So it sounded like he really was, and this was in his supposedly very non-religious part of his life before he had his boat trip. But it was interesting. So he didn't really seem to think people's bodies deserved much respect, and thought that disposing bodies properly was too inconvenient. So, I mean, those were his views before he was employed by the school that was dumping bodies in a river. So he had already seen all these problems, and this is presumably roughly his opinion on it.
So this was after his boat trip and his awakening, supposedly.
So when he was at the medical college in Illinois, that was after his awakening. When he was writing this, it was before that. So
it doesn't seem like much had changed.
I mean, what's interesting is he didn't write against it when the school was accused of stealing bodies and dumping them in the river and all of that. He was like, oh, this is groundless. Oh, this wouldn't happen here. And I'm like, you already knew it was happening in England a decade ago. Like, this isn't even new to you.
Yeah. I'm so stuck on, I don't see why you couldn't ask people, you couldn't get permission. And then also, what was his feelings about, if he, from listening to your other amazing podcast about the history of his life, it seemed like, he was definitely religious before his supposed awakening, you know,
at least
and
religiously
he was pretty
educated.
deep into it. Yeah. So it just seems like it goes against that for me.
It just
it's
feels
very strange.
It feels like 1800s privileged white man to me, of just these are just criminals, who cares, they're not like me. I almost wonder if this is a privilege thing. And I wonder, because he had presumably access to wealth, he traveled cabin class to America. He wasn't in the pauper suite downstairs. He was in the upper class. Couldn't he have just paid someone off to get him a body too? Because that's what I wonder, because there was another quote talking about how, quote, the student has long groaned under the weight of disabilities imposed on him by one cause or another, and has had to encounter grievous obstacles which have incessantly imposed him. It is refreshing, therefore, to his wearied and anxious mind to see but the prospect of relief, unquote. So he's talking about, being a student, this has been stressful for us to deal with, and it's just an obstacle, and we would be really relieved for you to actually deal with this problem for us. So this, I mean, he doesn't say me, he says the student. So it's just hard to see, you're not being very specific, but it clearly hits close to home for you. You're in this profession. This is the standard practice. So it's just, he was a medical student enrolled at the time. Students were pretty much required to provide their own bodies for dissection, not their own, but find their own somewhere, find one to claim. And he later worked at a school with a reputation for grave robbing. So it's just speculative. But could he at some point in his life have been a grave robber? Not
I think
fun,
so.
But as a sense of duty of I want to be in medicine, so I'm gonna grab a shovel.
Yeah, I think so. At the very least, he helped somebody. But why wouldn't he just do it himself? Yeah. I think it sounds like he got more okay with it.
I mean, he was defending it. So I think he would have been pro-regulation. It sounds like with the anatomy bill, he would have loved to have things not been like that. But at the same time, when that was standard practice, he also wasn't against it. And he wasn't oh, this needs to be stopped, and this is a scandal, and this is inappropriate, and my religious beliefs say it's wrong. And I actually looked up, I Googled grave robbing in the Bible because I don't know what the Christadelphian stance would be. And I was like, what would it be? So here's what the internet told me. They said that the commandment, thou shalt not steal, would apply. So it's a sin to steal bodies. So if John Thomas did this, then he definitely sinned. And it's a good thing he had his third baptism in 1847 to wash it away. Okay, so that is the story of John Thomas, and it is speculative.
Wow.
I can't say for sure, but they literally put in his biography. If you didn't want me to talk about it, why did you record it in the biography?
That is weird. That's strange. Even then, it was a weird thing to talk about or admit that you did, and to put it in your biography.
Yeah, and he was dancing around it, but why would, like, he had to go out of his way to mention this to Robert Roberts. Robert Roberts wouldn't have known about, like, this obscure incident from Illinois, living in Scotland, you know, and then Birmingham in the UK. Like, Thomas definitely told him, and he was like, oh, this is so significant, I'll put it in his biography. But this was a gunfight, and it was in John Thomas's biography. So if that's the fun fact you remember. There it is. Yeah. So are you ready for our second story?
Yes, I'm ready.
Okay. So this one is a little weird, and there's not a ton of information on it. Most of this came from a newspaper article that was published in Israel, and it involves two Christadelphian men. So I heard about this from an ex-Christadelphian who shared a report with me that used to be on a Christadelphian website, but the website was taken down. So apparently there was a big scandal about this Christadelphian guy about in the early 2000s, and otherwise I wouldn't have even known about this. And I'm not going to use his real name. He is still alive. I'm going to call him Jerry. So I was reading this report about Jerry, and it listed all kinds of inappropriate stuff he was doing, like grooming a child to marry him while trying to date other women in Christadelphia. So it was messy and it was dramatic. But none of those had like mainstream news things going on. So I was just skimming through, and I found this teeny tiny section of the report that details something that did make it into the news. And one of the newspaper articles is still online. The other one I was not able to find that apparently was online. I checked archives, couldn't find it. So without this report, however, I wouldn't have been able to link this crime to this newspaper to know it was a Christadelphian related crime. So you ready to hear what it was?
Yeah, let's do it.
Organ trafficking.
Ugh.
Yeah. This is
did he read the biography? Did he read? It's like, oh, he did it. I could do it too.
Honestly, at this point, it's kind of disturbing that one's stealing bodies, another stealing organs. We're having a weird trend.
Yeah, wow.
So maybe not as weird as I thought. So this is back in 2003. So I was still a Christadelphian then, but way too young. I don't know if this made news where people knew about this. I was not aware of it. So Jerry loved baptizing people. So he just wanted people to get baptized. And it's possible that he didn't always ensure that the candidates were meeting Christadelphian standards. But one day, he baptizes someone into the saving name of the Christadelphians. Jesus, whatever. And this new member of the Christadelphians is named in the article. So I'm going to reference it. This article is from Haaretz.com. And I'll use his real name because I'm sharing the source. So, can't really hide it. His name is or was, this was 2 decades ago. And if he's smart, he probably changed his name. And I literally don't know if he's alive or dead or not. I can't find him. His name was Albert Chernov. So apparently there was also a Christadelphian organization in the report. They called it the BBFU or the CCM. I couldn't find anything that would tell me what those abbreviations stood for, and I couldn't find a website. But all I know is these were Christadelphian related organizations, and they were sponsoring this guy, Albert. And I guess because he was a Christadelphian now, he did his dip. So he started working for these organizations, and the report lists him as a, quote, recruiter for the Brotherhood, unquote, which already is super creepy, right? Like,
yeah.
Like you could have said, oh, he's leading our preaching efforts in this region, but they're like, he's a recruiter. And Brotherhood just sounds sexist, right? It sounds like dark, sexist. I'm not a big fan.
Yeah, that makes me think of like recruiting people for your pedophile ring or something.
Yeah, that sounds about right. It does not sound good to just say the Brotherhood. I think for internal use only, they don't realize how creepy it is to have people who are
yeah.
And like at least Sisterhood is like Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants. Like it's like goofy and fun. Like Brotherhood, definitely more of a negative connotation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So besides them excluding women from their secret society, the report says that Albert was, quote, financially supported, unquote, by these Christadelphian organizations. So this is not going to be good. I have no kind of idea what kind of recruitment activities the Christadelphians thought he was doing, but the article describes what he was doing. According to the article, he was, quote, charged with having trafficked in human transplant organs, unquote, as well as, quote, charged with impersonating a doctor and performing indecent acts on potential organ donors, unquote. And they did not specify what that means, but why are people seeing this pretend doctor who's harming them and stealing their organs? So apparently he was quite convincing at recruiting people, recruiting for the Brotherhood and or organ trafficking ring, because he used, quote, extortion and threats, unquote.
Oh, fun.
Yeah, to recruit the organ donors. He was apparently targeting Russian immigrants, and the article alleges that he placed advertisements in Russian language newspapers advertising that he would pay people to sell their kidneys. And I can't read Russian, so I could not even try to track these down. So if anyone finds them, cool. I'm not even trying. They might be archived somewhere, who knows. So the prospective donors were then sent to doctors who apparently knew that the organs were for sale. They would get sent to Turkey for the surgery. Then the organs would get shipped across Europe or even to the United States. And it's unclear if anything happened after that. I did check the United Nations website to see what they consider organ trafficking to be. And their website says that, quote, although victims often appear to have consented to the removal of their organs, their consent is invalid when deception, fraud, or abuse of the position of vulnerability is involved. So in such cases, they are considered victims of human trafficking. So even if he did pay them, the fact that he was impersonating a doctor would have made it organ trafficking, apparently. So I don't know if any of them got paid, if any of them had, follow-up treatments and things like that and like proper care. All we know is that it is considered trafficking, and it was very shady. So I would not suspect that all of these things were followed through and handled well, considering he was already harassing, extortion, threats, impersonating a doctor,
and doing weird things to their bodies.
Yeah, I don't know, and I don't really want to know. I don't experience that, but yeah, there's a problem there. So it's all organ trafficking. So at some point, someone reported it, and Albert was arrested, released on bail, and then fled house arrest a few weeks before his trial was set to begin. So that's why, he disappeared. There was no follow-up. I don't know what happened after this. His attorney apparently said, quote, voiced fears that Chernov had been kidnapped, unquote. Which, I guess, but, based on the timing, that seems unlikely. And if he was kidnapped, who would have kidnapped him? The only organization we know he's associated with was the Christadelphians. So I was
we gotta shut this guy up.
Was he already a criminal who took advantage of the Christadelphians? Was he, trying to just get money from them and run? Or was he... what was the relationship is, I guess, my question. Did he use Christadelphian funds to fund this operation? I would want to know, because it said they were financially backing him. He was supposed to be recruiting. He's placing these advertisements. He's contacting these people, spending time with them, recruiting. Not in the way they expected. But it's what were the reports they were getting when he was submitting his timesheets? Oh, today I molested someone, while I was giving them an exam, a medical exam, and they're like, what? What is happening?
Oh my God.
So, or was he a criminal, and his other, criminal friends were like, oh, we have to kidnap you because you're causing us trouble? If he was kidnapped, I'm very concerned about what's going on, who did it. And so, again, it's really suspicious that the only organizations he was linked to were Christadelphians at the time that I'm aware of.
I could totally see that. I could totally see that being a part of the whole thing and then wanting to cover it up. Or, okay, that's so just my negative opinion.
We'll call it a fanfic version.
Yeah. Of course, I kind of have a darker view of all this stuff anyway, but the other thing is maybe they I don't know, what could they have been paying him for recruitment though? I don't get that
I would
part.
imagine reimburse him for the advertisements, right? Of oh, we're gonna advertise we're doing a lecture. Okay, I get that, but the advertisement was for people's organs. And was he paying them cash that he got from the Christadelphians to reimburse them for the expenses, to be hey, I told you I'd pay you for your kidney, here's $1,000 now, go on this plane to Turkey.
Maybe they couldn't read Russian either, and he was here's all these ads I put out to recruit people, and they're cool, here's your money.
I don't know, and I'm so shocked. What's craziest about this is this whole situation was covered in 4 sentences in this report. The entire thing. Most of this I had to get from the newspaper article. So that's why there's really no indication of what the extent of the relationship was with the Christadelphians, because the report itself was about 100 pages, just under 100 pages, and they're yeah, this guy Jerry sucks, so we wrote this whole report about him. And then in this one sentence they're Jerry also introduced us to this guy who stole some organs from these Russian immigrants, so he really sucks. And but let's go back to talking about how horny he is. And I'm no, wait, This scandal made it into the news. It impacted vulnerable people. He's a baptized Christadelphian at this point. Like, did he get disfellowship? Did you fire him from these organizations? If he prays for forgiveness, he gonna be in the kingdom? Like, I have a lot of questions about him being one of God's chosen people.
Yeah.
He didn't even face trial, so like at this point we don't know where he is. As far as I know, like I didn't see anything, but he MIA.
That's crazy.
And that's actually the end of this story, because that's all I could find.
Wow.
And so, yeah, it is so weird. So I found this report, found this newspaper article, and that's it. So I was able to see that he was a Christadelphian. He was being supported financially by the Christadelphians, and that's what he was doing with his money at the same time. And they were aware of it and did not bother to talk about it at all. They're like, let's talk about this guy and his horny problems. Let's not talk about the guy who literally stole a bunch of people's organs and dipped.
Oh my God.
Like, that's their priorities. So that was interesting. Yeah.
Oh, wow. And it feels like this is a much older story than the 2000s.
Before it was full
It seems like
bodies,
there's just not. It feels like this would have been a bigger story, 20 years ago than it is.
You would think. I would have thought someone would have heard about it. So I was like, maybe it's just because I was young, but I don't think a lot of people know about this story, honestly. It was so obscure.
I did not.
And it didn't sound like even the Christadelphians cared from the way it was referenced. They're like, oh yeah, it made the news, but he's gone, so whatever. Okay. Like,
that kind of tracks.
Do anything? Like,
they don't do anything.
Check in on the victims. You gotta make sure he's gone. Like, don't let the door hit you on the way out. Like, they didn't do anything. They're like, huh, that stinks. What a shame those people lost their organs because of a Christadelphian that we hired. Not our problem. So very interesting. So that's story number 2. Well, that time Christadelphians.
Wow, we got
trafficking.
We got a lot of organs in these last 2. A lot of dissection, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, it's gross. I didn't mean to, but it's a pretty ugly episode with the true crime. All right, 3rd story. So are you ready for the next of God's chosen people to make some questionable choices?
Yes, lay it on me.
Right. All right. So this story starts in New Zealand, and this one brings us all the way up to 2020. So this is going to be the most recent one across the board. A lot of people may have heard of this one just because it's more recent, but it starts with a 69-year-old woman. So we're changing our main character energy a little bit. Her name is Judith Ann Venn. So she was married to a man named Lance Hilton Venn for over 40 years, and they had several daughters together. However, the article that I saw online that I'll have in the show notes says that Lance was suffering from severe bipolar disorder, which was getting worse. And the first article I read was unclear about how it was getting worse, but another article stated that she was habitually understating her husband's physical violence to her, and that her husband had recently, quote, bought a boat, although they already had 4 in the yard, unquote. And this was being listed as indicative of his poor mental condition. So I was a little confused about this diagnosis, because I know people who have bipolar and they haven't even bought one boat and are leaving their domestic partners. So I was looking around, and fortunately I was able to find more articles than just that one. So an article that came out much later clarified things, because regardless of his formal diagnosis, there was a pattern of abuse. The second article stated that they believed that her husband had, quote, likely hit his wife very hard on the morning of his death, unquote. And apparently this was in part because she had bruises and 2 black eyes when she was taken to the hospital after the incident. So one of the articles also specified that her husband Lance had spent $20,000 on the boat, and that he had, quote, he had spent effectively all of their remaining finances on this boat, unquote. So the boat was really indicative of his financial abuse in that relationship. So the article also mentions that she was likely chronically sleep deprived, getting more isolated and desperate. It mentions that she had been suffering from a major depressive disorder. And why was she so isolated and desperate? The article says that Venn, quote, felt trapped as part of a close Christadelphian church community that did not look outside for help, unquote. And it caused her to feel, quote, shame and a desire not to besmirch her husband in the group, unquote. So apparently her husband's reputation was more important to these Christadelphians, either explicitly or implied, so that she believed it, whether they said it or not. that her physical, emotional, and financial well-being was just genuinely terrible, that she felt that way and was so isolated despite of being a community. So it was pretty sad to see that her husband's reputation was more important than her well-being. And that was how she felt being a part of this community. And I mean, I think we both
I am not shocked by that at all.
I'm not. Nope.
No.
So she was not going to people for help. She wasn't really going inside the group, and they said that they apparently did not know what was going on, or at least the extent of it. That she also wasn't seeking outside support because of that Christadelphian culture of keeping things under wraps, not involving professionals. So apparently she had tried once to get help from a professional mental health service that she had contacted, but she said that they didn't offer her much support. So the police did get involved when she murdered her husband.
And I was thinking it was going this way, and I was I was kind of hoping for her, in a way. Is that weird? I was like, I hope you get revenge, lady.
Yeah, the energy that I get from this, I don't know if you've seen it. So this feels like something from the musical Chicago. They have a song where they sing about killing their husbands and lovers, and they all say he had it coming. And I feel like this guy Lance, I never knew the guy, but it sounds like he had it coming.
He kind of deserved that, yeah.
Yeah. So she, quote, gave him an overdose by dissolving prescribed pills in his favorite vegetable soup, unquote.
Oh shit.
The second article I found to get more detail on this said that she put 50 pills in his soup. I don't even know how he ate it at that point. Was it an onion soup where you hide that flavor of prescription pills?
Oh my God, wow.
Okay, and then it gets a little darker. She then proceeded to cut his wrist when he was unconscious after eating the soup.
Just to make sure.
She was going for it at this point. She wasn't taking chances. And then apparently she tried to commit suicide, but it's unclear how she attempted it, but she did survive. She talked to the police, so she was functioning at least at that level. I don't know specifics afterwards. That's all just from the news articles. She did plead guilty. She was sentenced to 8.5 years for killing him. It was effective. He died. Don't know if it was the pills or the blood loss, but one of those. So she served 3 years by the time I found this other article, and it said she was eligible for parole, so it's possible she's actually out of prison now.
Wow.
Yeah, so this case honestly just feels kind of sad to me, because I don't think she would have committed this crime if she hadn't been treated poorly by her Christadelphian husband, and if she hadn't been so unsupported by her Christadelphian community. I mean, I'll admit, this is something wrong that she did. It was not accidental. It was a planned thing. But, I do feel for her, and I feel bad for the fact that she was treated so bad. She was run down emotionally, physically. She was being beat up financially. He was just ruining their lives for, over nothing. Buying all these fucking boats. And she felt like she didn't have a lot of options. And, she's supposed to have this close community of people that care about her that she's seeing regularly. I mean, people sometimes see each other 3 times a week at these services. But no one was intervening. She was not getting safe housing. She was not getting counseling. She was not getting resources for her and her husband that could have helped address these problems on either end. Either of them went to therapy or got separated or whatever. And I think a lot of ex-Christadelphians would have seen this kind of thing where religions are sweeping abuse under the rug. We both, have. I remember actually personally that my Christadelphian grandmother left my grandfather as soon as her youngest child turned 18. And one story that was told in the family was that she had to keep changing addresses because my grandfather was dangerous and stalking her after she escaped the marriage. And so I don't know the specifics because no one wants to talk about the specifics. And he's dead now, and she's passed away since. But it was disturbing to hear about that being in the family. And everyone's like, "Oh yeah, that's just how it was." And I was like, "You guys were both Christadelphians, so is that normal that everyone's just like, oh yeah, that's how that relationship was?" No one was like, oh yeah, he was abusive, we had to disfellowship him, or oh, we had to take her in and protect her. I didn't hear one story of anyone stepping up to protect her, and I didn't hear anyone stepping up to combat and kind of get rid of him, or step up and intervene with him and make him change his behavior or anything. So I've seen this kind of play out, or not seen it, but I've heard about this playing out in my own family. And the second article actually used her faith and devotion to the church to indicate how serious the circumstances were, that the abuse would cause her to, quote, break rules that go fundamentally against all her religious beliefs. And they try to say, like, oh, that's how depressed she was that she was brought to this. And, like, I don't disagree. Obviously, she was in a very bad emotional state to do this. I do think she was probably like a sweet woman who wouldn't have ever wanted to do this. But they don't really go far enough in that line of questioning to me. Like, what's the benefit of being a member of this church community if you're financially destitute, you're unsafe in your home, you're being beaten, you're suffering from severe depression, nothing's being done to intervene, and this is all about the reputation of your abuser, and you can't talk about any of this because it would make your abuser look bad. Like, is that really a great church community with like really like strong beliefs that are teaching her to be like a strong, happy woman? Like, no. Like, you're telling people, oh, God doesn't want you to commit these crimes, but we're not going to do anything to change the circumstances that cause these crimes to be committed. So, like, they're still going to happen if you're not addressing it. You know, people steal food when they're hungry, and women kill their husbands sometimes when they can't get away from the abuse. It's like, if you're going to try to reduce the incidence of this kind of violence, there are things you need to do to be more proactive about it in the early stages of abuse, rather than, you know, being like, oh, wow, this happened at the end.
Absolutely. And it's not just about benefits for her or the woman in the situation. How is that guy gonna have a good life if he can't have a good relationship? You know, like, that couldn't have been a good relationship for him either.
Yeah, and I think that help, like therapy, outside source help, or just like even talking about these things within the Christadelphian community itself, like having it be okay to talk about it would have not only benefited the woman in the situation, but also the guy. Like, how could that have felt like a good relationship to him? How could he have had a fulfilling life with this person if all of this stuff was with her fighting, and he felt like he needed to hit her, or like there's something deeply wrong with him that he needed help for.
Yeah.
And the Christadelphian community suppressed that in him, and also suppressed what she needed. And that is, I feel like, a problem across the board. And when you have situations where you have a particularly mentally ill individual, or somebody who wants to act out or feels like they can only act out in a certain way, that's when the worst can happen.
Yeah, it could have escalated into him killing her, honestly, at the rate that the abuse was
absolutely.
escalating, it sounds like. And he put her in a position where she really had nothing left to lose, where she was like, I can't take my money and leave and get an apartment. Like, at that point, she's like, well, he took all my money, so like, I'm just left with this husband.
I think she did, like you were saying, she felt like she had no options, no one to back her, support her, and like no out for her. There was no out for her, just kind of like there wasn't an out for him in a way, although he certainly had more power.
He was definitely had a lot of agency in this, and a lot of it was direct reflections of his actions that he took. But it does, like you said, it's a problem that even in the culture, there was no one to intervene and say, oh, like, we support you guys going to therapy. We'll support you guys having a separation to see if that helps your relationship. I was looking up New Zealand's laws about divorce, and it looked like you had to be separated for like 2 years or something in order to qualify. So I was surprised that there was like some stipulations on it. But I was like, even still, you could initiate a divorce. They were together for 40 years. At any point in there, they had time to potentially choose to separate, do a divorce, and move on with their lives. And so I always wonder, just because when I was at my meeting growing up, I remember there was a couple who just fought like cats and dogs. Their kids moved out. They were miserable together, and they wanted a divorce. But they talked to the arranging board, I guess, the arranging brothers, and the arranging brothers basically told them they were not allowed to get divorced. So in order to stay in this community and, have their, hope of eternal life, according to Christadelphian teachings, they had to comply. So for a time they were separated, but the goal was always to try to, I guess, move back in with each other in order to like stay in the church. And as far as I'm aware, they never divorced, so they are still unhappily together. And so I wonder, like, did this woman, Judith, go to her arranging board and say, hey, I want a divorce because my husband beats me and he spends all my money and like on this useless stuff. And to have them say, oh, we can't, that doesn't align with our interpretation of the Bible. So you have to stay there and be abused and be poor while he spends your money and hits you. And
Yeah,
so,
I think that is plausible.
yeah,
Very,
just
very plausible.
yeah, so like I would believe that just because I've seen that play out in my own meeting. And fortunately, it did not escalate to this point, but it did prevent them both from having a happy life outside. Even if they chose to be single, even if they chose to remarry, whatever choice they made. I mean, they're grown adults, which like Christadelphian arranging brothers seem to always forget, who can do whatever they want, but they care about what their community thinks. But it's interesting because the community doesn't seem to care that much about what they think and how they're feeling and what they need. So it is interesting how those restrictions play out. And I think that's one thing that article missed about talking about her faith. They're like, oh, she wouldn't have wanted to do this because of her faith. And I was like, I wonder how much of her faith put her in this situation. Whereas if she hadn't been a Christadelphian and she was, an atheist or something, would she have taken initiative? Would she have had a community outside that she could have left and not had judgment, where she would have been supported, where someone would have helped her file divorce papers, help her get a job if that's what she needs? Like, I don't know her circumstances, what she needed to get out, but I'm sure that would have been something that was kind of potentially reducing her options that she felt she had, and having less options put her more on this path to the ultimate ending the situation. So that's why I do wonder about the relationship there. And again, a little speculative. I don't know if she ever wanted a divorce or asked for divorce. We don't know the extent of the abuse, but based on what was said in the article and our own experiences with Christadelphians, I could see the religion playing a role in escalating the situation.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that. I think it could have played a huge part for all the entire 40 years that they were together.
Yeah. I'm also curious if going to prison changed her faith. So if she left the Christadelphians and reclaimed her autonomy, come on the podcast, say hi.
Yes, I would love to hear this woman's story.
I would be so curious if she's like, you know what, I did some reflections on what got me there and what I'm doing. But I also wonder, like, some people are like, oh, it brought me closer to God because I was alone, and so I can
Yeah,
only
it could
hope
go
that
either way.
it could go either way. So I hope that she would reclaim autonomy and be like, I never want to be in that position again. I'm never going to let these Christadelphian men, tell me what I can and can't do and keep me down. But after like 40 years of abuse, you almost wonder if she could do that, or if she would kind of feel stuck still. I don't know.
Yeah,
If that's all you know, and that's,
imagine like basically she had to start a new life
yeah,
like after that, and she what she was like almost 70 or what, I can't remember
69
how
when
old she
she
was.
killed him. So she would be in her mid 70s now.
Mid
Yeah,
70s, and all of a sudden
in
you
prison,
basically
restarting your life. Yeah.
have a new life when you get out of prison. What do? Like, you don't have a husband to go back to. The Christadelphian community probably doesn't really,
I
they
don't know.
probably
Yeah, what would they
tolerate you,
do?
but they
You
probably wouldn't want to deal with you because it reflects on them, right?
Yeah, you don't make them look good anymore. When you kept quiet and sat nicely every week, that was a nice head they could count on, like a numbers, like, oh, we have her here. But once you show up with problems, no, they don't
Mm,
want that.
no, they don't.
I think they would tell her, like, we don't really want you here, or just be awkward enough to, like, with that kind of that vibe of like being judged, and you can feel it, and you're like, oh, I don't feel welcome here. People aren't
Oh,
treating me
I
right.
know how that is really
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, the awkwardness. Ugh.
Yeah,
So,
I bet they couldn't like outwardly like tell her that they didn't want anything to do with her anymore, but she definitely,
I
well,
mean,
I don't know what happened, but I think that
well,
could have
I
been
don't
like,
know if she's officially out yet. It said she was eligible on parole.
oh,
I don't know. So if someone in New Zealand knows, feel free to, if she's left, get us in touch or keep us updated. But
yeah.
don't know. This was what I found online, because I had heard about her murder, and I was like, what?
She needs a support network. She
Yeah,
does. I
if
don't
she
know if
left,
we're
she should
it,
join.
but like,
Yeah, I
yeah,
don't know if we can
like,
handle that extreme, but we're happy to talk about problems she wants to unpack and vent about, And I'm sure
absolutely.
her story would be very interesting to hear. You ready for the fourth story?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay, so this one I learned about from you. when you sent me some stories about a former member of the Springfield Ecclesia, and I wouldn't have even known about this connection to the Christadelphians because it's not mentioned in the article you shared with me. So do you want to mention how you know Roger Hammond?
Mm. I used to call him, and I still sometimes do, call him Uncle Murder because
Whoa.
Uncle Murder.
Uncle
He is my
Murder.
uncle. Yeah, my
Yeah.
uncle Roger. He is my father's brother,
Mm-hmm.
and I thankfully did not know him really well. I do have memories of him. I remember him while his investigation was going on into what he did. He came back to Vermont and stayed with my dad. And when I was on
Ugh.
visitation, I saw him at my dad's house.
Knowing what was going on at your dad's house, that just makes me even more mad that you're in the situation with Uncle Murder and a very shitty dad, to put it mildly.
Yeah, I was looking back like so weird,
Yeah.
so gross.
Yeah. Not a healthy
Yeah,
method for raising a child, I
no,
would say.
no, certainly not.
Anyway. So I'm going to go through the news article you sent me a little bit and pull some
All right.
quotes for people so that they can know what on earth we're talking about. So the news article is a doozy, just starting from the first sentence. This is the first line of it. Here's the quote. After cheerfully quoting from the Bible and almost getting his lawyer thrown in jail for contempt, Roger M. Hammond, the television and radio personality Phoenix once knew as Mr. Fix-It, was convicted of murder and sentenced to 20 years in an Arkansas jail, unquote. There is so much going on in just that one sentence. It's like, what? Okay, so I'll give the fuller backstory. Roger was being sentenced here for second-degree murder of a 45-year-old Kentucky woman named Frances Mouser. She was shot alongside an Arkansas highway in 1988. He shot her twice in the head with a pistol, then stole her belongings, including a diamond ring and multiple cans of black-eyed peas. He stole her canned goods, but he shot her on the highways. Like, were they in the car? I don't know. I already have some weird questions. It's a weird story. Also, this was in April. Her body apparently wasn't discovered until June, but her belongings were traced to Roger Hammond. The article did not specifically mention his religion, but it did quote him extensively talking about religion. And apparently, upon the deliberation being announced, Roger said, quote, "Praise God, they did their job," unquote. When they found him guilty, he was like, "Oh, good." Like, what?
Right.
Praise God, they found me guilty, basically. So, however, he actually had interfered with them doing their job. So I don't know why he's so happy about them doing their job. Because he said right beforehand that he would not take the stand. And he said, quote, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I am innocent. And I release the power of God's angels to defend me and set me free." Unquote. Yeah, this man is quite a character just from seeing his quotes. First of all, saying that he's innocent, which he was very much not, and then saying, I'm glad they did their job while also interfering with them doing their job. So I don't know what screws were loose, but there was something weird going on. And then the whole "I release the power of God's angels." Like, are you God or like a prophet or what? Just fucking say that. I release the power of God's angels? You lead angels? Like, you lead legions of angels? What are you talking about? Also, they're supposed to defend him and set you free. Your defense did not work out for you because you were charged with, what was it, 20 years in jail? 20 years. So they did not defend you very well. Also, the set you free, that also did not work. There was never an angel that came and set him free. He had to serve his time. What's interesting in the article also was that he was a suspect in another murder because he lived above a woman who was knocked unconscious and then burned to death in 1984, which they did look into someone else. They thought it was someone else. So I will say that was that. But he was suspected, because of the murder he had already committed also. And he was a suspect of an armed robbery of a tourist couple at the Grand Canyon. And it did not specify much about it, but it was also in the article. It's like, oh yeah, also some armed robbery. So this guy who's leading God's Angels is a little bit of a questionable character, I would say. He's really into black-eyed peas and stealing from tourists at tourist destinations. I don't know. So as it turns out, he was not freed from prison by angels. He served his time. But he did eventually get out of prison, and he started another career. He became a minister of the Springfield Methodist Church. And to me, that's so fucking disgusting. You also sent me his obituary. He has passed away. He's no longer alive. But Frances was never able to live past 45 years old because she was shot in the head multiple times. Unfortunately, Roger, meanwhile, lived to 77 years old. He went on to run businesses, publish a book, and once again hold a place of privilege in a religious community, becoming a minister before dying at 77. So, interestingly, the time he murdered someone was left out of his obituary.
It sure was.
He sounds like quite a guy, just from
I didn't
this
realize
scene.
he wrote a book.
Yeah, he had written one book in the obituary, it said. I think it was he was called Mr. Fix-It. I think it was related to stuff like that, like fixing things. And
right.
it wasn't like a memoir of that time I murdered a woman. That would have been a very different kind of book.
Yeah, that's crazy. I did not realize he wrote a book. I'm kind of relieved that it was about fixing stuff, but I
it wasn't
wouldn't
a
trust
memoir.
that book, people. If you want to know how to fix something, don't read anything from Roger Hammond.
Don't buy it. Don't support that.
Definitely don't buy it.
Don't. Yeah. At the end of his life, it seems he was not affiliated with the Christadelphians, but he was originally Christadelphian, and that is where he got his initial understanding of the Bible. He was still affiliated with Christadelphian family, as you saw as well. Literally after he murdered this woman, he went and stayed with your family. But you had kind of said, I think, that you thought he wasn't really wanted back with the Christadelphians after, his time in prison.
I don't think so. It's kind of similar to what I was just talking about, what I think might happen with the other story with that woman when she
Judith
gets out of jail. That they really don't want any publicity.
Like bad publicity, yeah.
Because they don't want the community to think any worse of them than they already do. And I think they probably, like what I was saying, they probably like tolerated him a little bit, but then didn't like invite him into services or anything like that. People always felt uncomfortable about this story.
I mean, that makes sense. I mean, this is a big thing.
Absolutely. And the story in my family, the thing that he had told people is that this woman was a prostitute. It's interesting reading about it. Like, I know that there's only really that article, but nowhere does it say that. And I think that he was just trying to like justify his actions in a way.
But I even find that raises questions of, one, if that's the case, why are you with her and stealing her belongings? Like, do you have access to her home? Why were you with her at night? At what point do you not feel that she has a right to live? Like, why are you doting out life and death? Why are you treating a woman this way?
Well, he can call down the angels. So
why didn't he let them take care of it?
Seriously. He really sounds crazy. Like if you read this article, which is by far, I think that the only thing that I could find.
I found one through like newspapers.com, so I'll also drop that in the show notes for people. But it's very similar, I believe.
He just sounds like the craziest. But I mean, he was obviously, but the craziest religious fanatic you can imagine. And that was my uncle.
I find it terrifying. I can only imagine like his unhinged exhortations, how he treated people, feeling like he had a special place with God, it sounds like, where he thought like God was gonna like defend him and protect him. And I mean, he got a long life, so like technically he had a longer life than the people that were associated with him.
Yeah. The arrogance that he portrays from that article, and then even like coming back to his hometown community after getting out of jail,
That feels
W-
really gutsy. You would think most people would like change their name and go somewhere else, but instead he's like, no, I'm just gonna go back and switch churches and
Yeah, I
right
mean,
back to Springfield.
I think the only people that remembered this though were the Christadelphians
Yeah,
because
who like knew who he was.
that article is really hard to find.
It's old, it's
And
hard to find for sure.
yeah, this being happening back in the 80s, I actually have talked to people randomly in Springfield um, who knew him, and they were like,
Mhm.
"Are you related to Roger?" And I was like, "What? Oh my God!"
That's
I was like, "What do you know about Roger?"
yeah.
Yeah. And I had to be like really careful because they were friends with him, sort of like
Oh, that's gross.
uh, it was just,
And that's the thing with the obituary was it not only didn't include that, but it was like, oh, he ran a business, he wrote a book, he was a minister, and like, and you see like this photo of him, and it talks about like he had a family, he had like a wife and kids and stuff, and I was just like,
yeah,
this is so uncomfortable having seen this article first. And that being the first impression, as opposed to if you saw the obituary first, you'd be like, oh, this seems like a nice family man, long life, happy life. And then you're just like, he shot someone in the head twice on the side of a highway. I can't even imagine the circumstances that would cause that in his mind to justify that. Like, I don't understand. It said she just like moved to another town to like get a new job, and then she was just murdered on the side of a highway, and her body
mm,
left to be found like 2-3 months later.
crazy.
Like, she didn't deserve that. I don't know who she is, but I can tell you she didn't fucking deserve that.
That's
And
for
then this
sure,
guy got to
especially from
live
this
this
guy.
prosperous life and just continue being an arrogant jerk and getting out of prison after murdering someone. Seems pretty wild. And also he
Yeah,
sounds mentally unhinged and still got out of prison.
seriously. Yeah.
Like, yeah.
And I mean, obviously he talks about a lot about God in the courtroom.
Yes.
I think a lot of his arrogance is from being a Christadelphian, unfortunately. I think
And the patriarchal
he,
society in general,
the
yeah, which
patriarch,
is
yes,
heavy in Christadelphians of men being the best and getting
exactly.
platformed and all that. And be able
Yeah,
to have
kind of the
higher
like,
status than you might outside of the Christadelphians. Because we can
yes,
kind of be
yes.
like the star speaker of your ecclesia of 50 people, but in the wider world, no one's ever heard of you, and no one wants to hear what you're preaching. And so it's very much you have star power where you have these people telling you how amazing you are, whereas that maybe you don't get that anywhere else, and so it can maybe be an unbalanced thing where you're getting a lot of ego boost from just being in this community.
Oh yeah, I think that definitely played. I think that plays a part more times than you'd want.
Yeah, and you have a little bit more insight, at least with Springfield, but it seems like there was a lot of toxic dynamics there, so potentially even it could have been amplified or worse based on the people that were there, reinforcing that or something similar, where it was just these really strange views, very toxic views may have been predominant, because it sounds like he wasn't the only one that was making poor decisions in the 80s in Springfield, we'll say.
No, not at all.
You ready for our fifth story?
Yeah.
All right.
Yep, I'm ready. I'm primed.
Yeah. And
Thanks, Uncle Murder.
moving on from Uncle Murder, which what a nickname. Our last Christadelphian true crime story today is about the infamous Christadelphian serial killer, Gary Lee Schaefer. And Keturah, you also already know about this guy. Do you want to tell the listeners how you knew this guy's name?
I do. He is my cousin. He was in the Springfield Ecclesia. Um, and I mean, most of those people are my family. So it's not a big shocker that he's my cousin.
Yeah, just like
He,
Uncle Murder.
yep. He also worked, there's a lot of connections to me, unfortunately. He worked at Susie Motors, which was the only neighbor of ours. Our house was right next to it.
Oh, wow.
And the murder, the kid, that what happened with one of the girls is that happened right down the street from my house where he kidnapped her.
Okay, yeah.
And within walking distance. Yeah.
That's terrifying growing up knowing that. You're right in it. Because, I mean, he really didn't go far from Springfield to commit his crimes. And I'll go through and kind of detail them and kind of give people a timeline for people who don't know this. And actually, even some of the people who have covered it, I'm just going to add a little more detail for some of it. But yeah, it was pretty much just terrorizing this town. And it's very bad. I'm just going to start with this right now. This one's going to be more of the heavy true crime stuff, less toxic soup. So I'm going to share some information about him that I've compiled. There is a book that I pulled a lot of this information from, and I'll reference a few page numbers for people, but it's called In the Shadow of Death, The Hunt for a Serial Killer by Philip Ginsberg. It discusses 2 serial killers in this area, and it was really helpful. There's also some other resources for this episode I'll list. You can even find his Wikipedia page. There's digital newspaper articles. There's a couple podcasts that cover Gary Schaefer in detail. One of those, it was actually funny because they call the Christadelphians the Christadelphians, which is a new one. And unfortunately, I heard it after we made our intro music, so it didn't make the cut. But that's another one. But we won't be going as in-depth as the other podcast that will really tell you kind of the play-by-play for a lot of it. But we're going to kind of focus on getting through this with what time we have, since we're doing 5 stories in one episode. But if you want more information and you can handle all the grisly details, you can try listening to those podcasts, and they're a good place to start for this. So to start with the history of Gary Lee Schaefer was born in Allentown, Pennsylvania in 1951, but his family moved to Springfield, Vermont when he was a child. Once the family moved to Vermont, they decided to join a Christadelphian ecclesia, which still exists today in the same old schoolhouse. Gary eventually joined the Navy, which he remained in for 10 years, eventually returning to Springfield in 1980. There were some rumblings surrounding his behavior, as Navy records record that Gary had been in some trouble. Apparently it was for arson and illegal drug use, according to Ginsberg's book. It also records that when he moved back to Springfield, he started working for Thomas Susie at Susie Motors, and that at some point he had been married but had an affair and divorced. So at the time of his arrest, he actually lived with his mom, and apparently many Christadelphians were neighbors in that part of town. On page 108 of Ginsberg's book, it recorded that, quote, the Schaefers attended worship services and other church functions at least 3 nights a week, in addition to Sundays. The children were discouraged from socializing, even talking with children in the community who are not members of the church, unquote. So you can kind of tell it's a Christadelphian community. That sounds about right. I would say the Navy thing and the divorce stick out to me because those were frowned upon by Christadelphians. So interesting that he kept going back to it. But otherwise, I would say a lot of this sounds pretty traditional, going to services multiple times a week, being in a close community of Christadelphians, and even networking with Christadelphians for your career is something I've heard about from other people. Okay, so doing research for this episode is actually why I visited the Springfield Christadelphian website, by the way, which we had talked about in your interview episode. I went to their website, and under history, they wrote that, quote, today there are Christadelphians in many lands throughout the world. Their love and compassion for others and for each other shines brightly. Through their determined and unselfish efforts, working together to share their hope and to help the poor. Many more are being taught these precious truths from the Bible, and many are being baptized daily, unquote. So that's what the Springfield Ecclesia is presenting to the world. However, it doesn't mention Gary Schaefer, Roger Hammond, any of the other notorious Christadelphians who originated in that ecclesia. Your father, who we mentioned in your ecclesia, child sexual abuse. Great. So I guess maybe that's why they talked about Christadelphians in general and not the Springfield Ecclesia. Not these ones. Because just from an outside perspective of someone, I've never been there. I don't know anyone personally. I know you who has left, but I don't know anyone that's there. So it's not trying to pick on them. But as someone who's never been, I would be honestly terrified to just bring a child to that ecclesia, given their reputation as being selfish, cruel, abusive. Those are the words that come to mind thinking of the stories of the people who have come out of this ecclesia. So it was pretty wild seeing the website. I was like, oh, we're just not talking about this whole history. All right, we're just going to hide the history.
Of course not. Of course not.
That's what they're going to present. It's oh, yeah, your children are definitely safe here. We love people. So going back to Gary, One thing I learned from my research is that Gary's criminal activity was actually more extensive than I'd initially learned when I was just hearing about the murders. I mean, this is no surprise. We're going to be talking about how he's a serial killer. His first attack on a young girl that I found documentation of appears to have been in 1974. So he would have been 23 years old, and he attempted to abduct a 13-year-old girl in Massachusetts. So this was on page 110 of Ginsburg's book, but the author didn't provide much detail on the incident, and he said it didn't go to trial because the parents really didn't want to traumatize their daughter by doing that. So that was actually the earliest I could
I know
find
about that one.
documented. Yeah, and I didn't hear about that in the podcast either. So that's where I'm starting to try to do like the fullest history that I can. And again, a lot of that was from the book. So if this is really interesting to you, you can read through that yourself. It's believed that the next attack was 5 years later with the suspected killing of Sherry Nastasia. She's a 13-year-old girl from Springfield, and in September of 1979, when he was 28, the event happened. So unfortunately with this one, there was very limited evidence to charge him with murder because her body wasn't found until several months later and it was very decomposed. So they were having trouble determining how she died and to get the pieces put together of who took her. And again, we're talking about the 70s and the 80s. So you don't have, the door cams, you don't have cameras everywhere and like toll booths. You don't have as many people. A lot of these areas were pretty remote when we're talking about Vermont. So that's definitely going to play a role when we going back to these old murders where we just didn't have the technology we have today. So 2 years later, August 1981, Gary kidnapped a 12-year-old girl named Teresa Fenton from Springfield, Vermont. She was found barely alive, moaning, and partially buried on a back road. Despite being found alive, she never regained consciousness and died shortly afterwards. She died because she was beaten so severely by 30-year-old Gary after being left to die alone in the woods overnight. If that story alone doesn't make you hate this man, I don't know what to tell you. So, we could use the Harbingers of Destruction right now, swinging this guy.
Yes, seriously.
So after that was a kidnapping. So a young woman named Dana Thurston was hitchhiking in November 1982 when she got into Gary's vehicle. Now, he was 31 years old at the time, and he told her his name was Stan. He began sexually assaulting her and threatened her with a gun if she tried to escape or declined his advances. He also forced her to drink alcohol, and she was only able to escape after saying she was going to throw up, so he let her out of the car to get something to calm her stomach. When he let her out of the car unattended, she screamed for help, and a man came out and scared Gary off. Gary, if you listen to any of the other podcasts, they'll tell you what a little pussy-ass bitch he is. Gary then, like every podcast I listen to on him, they just call him names and they're like, we're disgusted with you. So you can listen to these people, especially the Gen Zers talking shit about him, amused me a little bit.
I love that. Yeah, I love that.
I love hearing them talk shit about this man. This piece of garbage. So Gary then crashed his car after she ran away and tried to conceal evidence, but like he was an idiot as well as. And so her clothes that he had forced her to remove while she was in the car with him were actually later found in his backseat. Like he wasn't even smart enough to remove those. And the items he had tried to hide in the woods were recovered. But it was a really disappointing twist because, just due to the lack of technology, the lack of thorough data entry, lack of collaboration among police departments, despite Dana Thurston detailing his car to the police in minute detail, she was incredible. She knew what the sticker was like on the front of the car,
really good.
Like what the steering wheel cover was, and told them absolutely everything about it. He crashed his car the same day. So a man with the exact description, the same car with the description, they were not able to link this vehicle to the crime. So she did amazing, and if this happened today, he would have been caught that day. And it would have prevented further crimes. I have the hope to say that. However,
I hope that the police would be more competent.
Yes. And I'm willing to say, maybe part of it was the lack of technology and things like that. He crashed in a different town, different things going on. It was like 20 miles away or whatever. So maybe there wasn't the collaboration. They said that there was no line on the data and form to say what color the vehicle was and stuff. So when they were searching for the vehicle, no one apparently knew what color it was, which seems basic.
It's so basic.
Seems very basic. So again, like, that's why everyone's really disappointed with the police. So if you hear these podcasts and you're going to be disappointed in the police, I'm sorry. So unfortunately, this did not end his things. We have a lot more to go. And I'm not even done with this story. So I will say that this was the first time a victim was able to repeat what he had said to her, able to get a description of what he looked like. So when Gary, pretending to be Stan, told Dana that, while she was in the car, that I, quote, like raping girls, unquote. And he told her that he killed the ones who resisted him, which he had to do while he was in the Navy. So he had been stationed in Norfolk, Virginia, and Newport, Rhode Island. So it is possible that there are 2 more unsolved rapes and murders by Gary, but he also lied and said his name was Stan. So nothing apparently was found afterwards to able to say, hey, there's an unsolved murder, rape of a young girl here. But at this point, I don't necessarily not believe him because he's already done it. So it's possible at this point that he had already murdered 3 girls and kidnapped several more. But again, that is just based on what he had said, as well as the facts that were presented here. So these are the cases and areas linked to him. So now we're going to keep moving on. After this, in 1983, he is now a 32-year-old man. Gary kidnapped Katie Richards, an 11-year-old girl. In fact, Gary tried to kidnap 2 girls, Katie Richards and Rachel Zeitz, but Rachel ran away because he threatened them. And so while Katie obeyed when he demanded they get in the car, Rachel ran. So only Katie was taken. Her body was found several hours later after she had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death. So once again, he had a very consistent mode. He always sexually assaulted his victims, and he always basically bludgeoned them to death, like hitting them in the head, the neck, making sure that they weren't going to survive. And they were generally little girls. So what's even worse was he had totaled his car after kidnapping and assaulting Dana. So he actually kidnapped her while borrowing his mom's car. Yeah, in his mom's car. And while wearing a Christadelphian sweatshirt from a Christadelphian youth event.
Yes, that he might have led because he was leading the youth group.
Yes, at the time in that area. Yep, it said he was leading events 3 nights a week in one of the sources I saw. So it's at this point, it's kind of common knowledge that he was leading youth because I saw it in at least 3 sources. So somewhere out there it had specified that it was multiple nights a week. So on page 92 of the book, In the Shadow of Death, it records that the police, quote, learned that the shirts had been made up specifically for a gathering of young people held at a local church. The letter across the front said Christadelphian, the name of the church. The Christadelphians were a fundamentalist group whose members asserted the literal truth of the Bible and believed that Christ would return and establish his kingdom on earth. The church was small, about 18 families, 50 people in all, and close-knit. Most of them lived in the part of Springfield and socialized with other members, unquote. So that's interesting to hear about them. I actually see the Christadelphians in this book about a murderer. Like, I didn't know this when I was a member, but it's crazy. And again, it's like, oh yeah, that sounds like that could have been like my family here. Like, oh, here's this small church of all these little families that all socialize with each other multiple times a week. I'm like, yeah, that was like my childhood, but without the murderer. But it's like Gary was specifically involved in youth events. So he would be with Christadelphian children pretty much 3 days a week. And he was, I would say, clearly grooming Christadelphian girls. In the book, it also mentions one teenager in the Springfield Ecclesia mentioned that she was friendly with Gary, and he wrote her personal letters and advised her about her personal problems. And I think in the modern day, this would be like the grown man with no ethical boundaries who's like texting or messaging an underage girl on social media or like on an app. Be like, oh yeah, give me your Snapchat. Oh, you're such a smart girl. You know, I would never tell anyone else things I tell you. And just that manipulation until they can get them for sexual favors. It's very troubling to see that relationship. So the other thing is that I think for Christadelphian brothers, I think the problem is also, would they see this as troubling? of having this grown man helping this young girl about her personal problems, wouldn't they be like, oh, of course you should advise her? Shouldn't all women in the ecclesia, look for help from the arranging brothers? Like, I feel like that wouldn't have been discouraged, which is another red flag. And again, maybe it's different by ecclesias and different opinions or whatever, but I feel like if anyone was aware of that, they should have flagged it, but they did not. And so they were allowing him to write these letters and know details about these adolescents' lives constantly around them with no background check or anything.
Oh no.
So I find
Yeah.
this very problematic. And just like after
He was
reading,
family too.
yeah, and after listening to true crime, you're just like, oh, I can see so many red flags. Like once you see the patterns and know what to look for, you're like, oh, someone should have stepped in. Someone else should have
Yeah.
been involved.
And I can't help but think, and especially just from my experience there, I can't help but think that somebody knew something was off. Not like that there's a serial killer, but
But that something was wrong with him and those girls.
yeah, absolutely. This person she must have been 13, 14 at the time.
She's
And
so young.
very young. And this still affects her to this day.
Oh, I believe it.
Absolutely. She still really remembers him and their relationship that they had. She felt very
That's
close to
so
him.
wild that it was such a deep relationship for someone who is still a child with this grown man.
He was 32 and she was 13 and 14. And they were
yeah.
cousins.
Yeah, which also problematic.
Yeah. I feel I feel bad for so many people in the ecclesia, including myself, for having this happen. And the effect of it. Yeah, keep going.
And so going back to our story, now that the police were narrowing in on the Christadelphians after they were able to learn what the sweatshirt read and identify it to a very small group of people in the immediate community in the town, they contacted Gary's cousin, James Millay, who identified Gary from the composite image. And he was actually able to confirm that Gary was in that area on the day of the kidnapping and murder. So now they had evidence to charge him with the murder of Katie Richards and the kidnapping of Dana Thurston. It all matched up. They were able to find the sweatshirt at his home. They were able to confirm he was at that place, that he was in that car, so on. So during the investigation into Gary's crimes, the police also discovered 3 additional reports of sexual molestation of female relatives and in particular children. And this one I also did not hear about in the other podcasts, but this is on page 109 of the book for anyone who wants to look into it. And I believe personally that these girls and young women were Christadelphians, since it says they're relatives. The book did not specifically confirm that suspicion, and possibly due to risk of revealing their identities because it was such a small group and they were minors. So potentially something like that could have been an issue. But according to the book, quote, one attack took place within months of the abduction of Dana Thurston. Schaefer drove the young woman around before parking in a rest area off the interstate highway, where he forced her to perform oral sex and other acts. When she attempted to resist, Schaefer became furious and reached under the dash for something. She was saved when another car drove into the rest area. Schaefer drove her home without saying another word, unquote. He was truly disgusting.
Oh my God, that is so creepy.
Would violate young girls, threaten them, and at the slightest provocation and assertion of their own autonomy and resistance would kill them. So at this point, there's documentation of between 7 to 10 incidents of sexual assault against mostly minor age girls. And this was a man who was a Christadelphian in good standing who was allowed to be around Christadelphian girls and children up until the day of his arrest. What's wild was also that the ecclesia that Sunday at the Springfield Ecclesia, after James identified him, apparently none of the brothers said anything about it to him. None of them were saying, like, hey, get the fuck out until the investigation is complete. Like, we don't believe you're safe here. No. What's wild to me is the only person who spoke to him about this was a young, underage girl. She talked to Gary thinking it was a joke, saying like, "Oh, are the police after you?" Once he knew that the police were aware that he was a suspect, he threw up because, again, little pussy ass bitch.
He went
And
into the
then
bathroom that I know so well in that women's schoolhouse, and he threw up like a
that's
little
probably where he
baby,
changed into
like
his
a little.
baptismal robes first. Now he's throwing up because he murdered kids and got fucking
Like, oh
caught.
no, they caught me.
Yeah.
Puke.
Excuse you. They caught you. You left little girls for dead after raping and beating them to death. How do you think
But
they
you can't
fucking
handle being
felt?
caught.
You
Yeah.
can't handle a cop showing up and talking to you?
Yeah.
Ugh,
Just like,
infuriating.
he's just disgusting beyond belief. That place was full of men who could have done something. Like, aren't they supposed to, like, these are the people who as I was growing up, thought that I could trust, that they were there to protect me. And I found out personally that they weren't. And this story is just another story of that.
Yeah, and that's part of why it's so powerful having you on here, because I know you are feeling very brave in telling your story on this podcast. And once we talked about it before I even started the podcast, that you had been in this ecclesia and knew about this and were living in this town when this was unfolding. I'm glad that you were okay with coming on here to talk about it, because it is unbelievable that this happened in the Christadelphians, and they are so dedicated to keeping their image clean and trying to hide it. And no one will talk about this, and I didn't know about it, but this affected real people who are still alive today. I can't imagine how many women and children and in that community were affected. And not even just Christadelphians, but every woman in that community was terrified for her daughter. People in that community lost their daughters. Like, I can't imagine having to drive by and see that ecclesia if my daughter was raped and assaulted and killed by a man in good standing at that fucking church. I would be furious. I
Uh,
can't get over. And there's how many people have come out of that ecclesia alone who have been dangerous people.
yeah. So this happened before the uncle murder incident and before my father was arrested for what he did and before other things happened. And what I really think, because I think it's entirely possible, and I know for a fact that there was some abuse happening amongst the arranging brothers, but I think this incident with Gary Schaefer set off the Christadelphians were that they wanted to suppress anyone from getting the authorities involved in anything, and they also wanted to, you know, be separate from the rest of the community. What happened when this thing happened is that all eyes in the community, which hardly nobody knew about this little church. It's on the edge of town. They all kind of lived in that area too. There's a road. The road is called Delphian Road that the church is on.
Oh, I didn't
And
know
that's
that.
where
Wow.
most of the prominent families lived on that road.
Yeah, it said
So
that his neighbors were all Christadelphians next to him.
Yes. So at this time when Gary Schaefer did this stuff and it all came out, nobody really knew about this little church. And then when it happened, everyone turned in. And it wasn't just Springfield, it was all the other communities around were like, well, you know, what's going on there?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, absolutely. And what I think it really did was it made that suppression even worse. So when other things happened, like my dad and my brother-in-law and the other things that I know that were happening in there, they were even more secretive and even more like saying like I heard, not only was it like an unspoken rule not to talk to the authorities, but it was actually spoken. Like when my mother
Wow.
went to ask for help, or like,
Yeah.
I would hear back that, they don't, that's not what we do. And um
Wow.
so it really became even more insular than they
Mm.
already were. And I think things that were already happening that were bad just ramped up within that bubble.
That's terrifying. And again, the exact opposite of what you would almost hope and expect is like, oh, well, we're under all this scrutiny. We should like play above board. We should report other things. We should put measures in place to protect children and
That is,
girls. You would
yes,
think that that would be
that
your first instinct, especially among the
did
women.
not
I
happen.
mean, the sisters should be at
It,
least half the meeting. Typically, they're actually, according to statistics, the majority. There are more women supposedly in Christadelphia than men, from what I've heard.
mm,
And then even like in my ecclesia, I know is true, just among the widows outliving men and so on. So you would think that they would be advocates for the children. Aren't they like raising them in Sunday school and giving birth to them and all of this? You would think that someone would
but they
finally
have no
care.
power. They
That's
have
true
no
too.
power. And in my ecclesia, I was shocked to hear other people in the ex-Christadelphian group saying that sisters could vote in like ecclesia stuff. Like,
Hmm.
uh, what? Like that?
Oh, they couldn't
There
even
was
vote at the ecclesia for the
I
ecclesial affairs?
I had never heard anything like this. It was the arranging. It
Oh,
wasn't arranging board. It was
oh,
arranging brothers.
well, yeah.
The brothers were the heads of the
Hmm.
church. There was one particular brother that
Yeah,
was
that's often how it goes, where
most
it's
particularly the head.
certain people
Um,
get power. Yeah.
right. So yeah, at mine, they definitely didn't have power at all and were just oppressed, oppressed, oppressed further, as time went on.
Well, it sounds like so many were potentially dealing with abuse at home. So I'm sure it made it
Mhm.
harder to have the resilience and strength to deal with other things when you're just trying to survive your domestic life, let alone make
Absolutely.
changes in your church and in your community. But that is pretty terrible. You would almost hope that even the community would push and be like, hey, like, we need to
Uh,
implement better programs, make more awareness of support and, places you can call
yeah,
and resources you can get,
that
because
is
that could have
exactly
probably
what
been
I
pretty life
want them to
saving.
do. That I want them to do this. It has been, I am still traumatized by this, and I'm not the only one.
Oh no. There was, I mean, it said 3 girls were assaulted by him who were family members and
Yes,
survived. To know that he was a killer and to realize how they barely survived, that he could have killed them, that if he hadn't been caught, they could have been killed, as well as just the trauma of sexual assault to begin with, and the trauma of it being a family member, and of
that
an
is
older
horrible.
person with power, and someone who went to prison for murder. Like, I can only imagine any one of those things traumatizing someone, but let alone the compacted amount of that. And I don't know how young the youngest ones were. I mean, he was going for children who were just like
Like
10, 11 years
10,
old.
11. Yeah, my sisters were that age when this was happening, and thankfully, we were away at, but so between 1980 or maybe 79 and 84, we were
Wow, right, when
mostly
this was mostly
gone.
happening. Yeah.
Yeah, but my mom, I think when I think they came back, like maybe it was 82 at one point, and my
Okay.
mom was worried because there were these incidents had been happening during that time, and
Yeah.
she was like worried for the girls, and at that time she had no, I mean, obviously no idea that it was Gary, and Gary was
Yeah.
working right next door at CC
Yeah.
Motors.
That they were
Um,
so vulnerable. That's traumatizing to learn that afterwards, even to
yeah,
realize you had that fear and that was completely
yeah,
justified.
but
You
he
were
was so
so close.
close.
So
Yeah,
close.
but he was so close already, just being family and being there at the ecclesia.
Yeah, him having access to the kids at meeting all the time and taking them places. Because it sounds
It
like
was
he was able to
crazy.
get one of these young girls in his car and no one batted an eye. And you know why?
No,
Because he was always around them. They thought he was a trusted family member and this man of God. And then look at how he abused that. And he was able to get away with this. And I imagine this young girl with this 30-year-old man, she's might not have even spoken up about it for a long time until the cops came and fortunately pursued this to discover that these 3 other girls had been impacted.
Yeah, I'm glad that they did the investigative work because
Yeah.
I do kind of like, I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't know how it is to be a police officer, but I do kind of feel like some of the stuff that they did in the story wasn't so great.
Yeah, there's
Like
definitely
just
some
a little
problems I heard in the
incompetent.
podcast. In the book, it sounded
Yeah,
like he was talking with them and working with them to get kind of their version too. So I think that's probably helpful for people who have concerns about that to read the book as well. And at the
yeah,
same
that's
time, there's
true.
also another killer, which we talked about a little bit off podcast about the Connecticut River killer. So
Yes,
there's podcasts about that, and that's also in the book. So what was
I
even
was
more
kind of
confusing
like
was having 2 serial
confused
killers in kind of the
at the
same
same
general
time.
area. Although Gary was more localized to Springfield specifically, I would say. And
Yay.
he beat his victims. The other guy preferred to stab them. So that was also the
Oh.
difference there. Yeah. All killing young girls.
What I find really interesting now about this story is that, well, I know that there was scrutiny of the Christadelphian ecclesia at the time. I feel like it would just have blown up now if this would
Oh,
have happened.
yeah.
I think, like,
Yeah.
think about
With
like if
social
this
media and
happened now.
everything. Yeah, if
Social
like
media.
7 girls got like raped and kidnapped and murdered.
And they found this guy who was like the youth leader at this
Oh,
little
yeah.
church. Oh
Oh,
man, it like they would get so much backlash.
yeah. I feel like
And
more people would have gotten arrested than just Carrie at that point. Where like they'd
yeah,
have
and I
texts
think
and
they sh
emails and shit. Like they would have
Mm.
so much more evidence in the technology of today.
Oh yeah, I think a lot more could have been
Yeah.
uncovered, and
Yes.
maybe some other really horrible things that happened after could have been prevented.
Yes,
Um,
there was an opportunity there for sure.
yeah. Because there were it's just a little too coincidental to have so many people, so many
Mm-hmm.
pedophiles in one place,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because Roger was too.
Jeez.
It
I mean,
he
not surprised.
I mean, I know for a fact that another one of my family members was abused by him before he killed the woman. And yeah. And of course my dad and
Yeah. So we've got at least 3 pedophiles
at
in
least
an
three
ecclesia
in
that
one
has
place.
at most 50 people in it, and probably let's say half of those are like women that are being abused. So you've got like 20 people who are probably of age and have power to do so. So you're looking at a pretty high percentage right there. And the
Yeah,
fact
I think
that
it's pretty
is
messed
most
up.
likely more than one person knew about it, and there's potentially enabling, covers up, people
I
with power
mm,
to suppress it, whether or not they're actually engaging in it, but suppressing it and not providing any consequences. That's part of my problem with Christadelphian led initiatives is that they're like, oh, well, because, we're different now. Now we're definitely going to go to the authorities when there's child abuse. I'm like, well, looking at your track record, you guys weren't so great at handling affairs in house. So maybe you finally admit that you should have some outside help. You should contact helplines. You should contact the authorities. You should bring in counselors. That none of it should be handled in house. The only option should be call the police, let them handle it, and tell you what you need to do. I mean, at this point, we've seen how much they've bungled things historically and how easy it is for them to wield their power to hide things. And so when you look into it, it's like, okay, all of this is basically then falls back on the Christadelphians, where it's like, why weren't the people doing anything proactively to prevent these things from happening? And if these things happened and they were then made aware of it, I haven't seen any evidence of them trying to actually help the victims to make any reparations, to do anything, to actually make it better. And so it seems like it's all about them and all about their reputation. And if that's all you care about, I don't trust you with setting up programs to protect people. I truly don't.
mm, yeah,
You care
yeah.
about yourself. And I've see so many examples of it, and I don't think it's a good system to have it be self-governing in that way. That's what you see is when people have power, they'll abuse it. you need an outside source for accountability, because if you're just having your number two be the accountability for the number one with the most power, guess what? It's not going to work. He has too much power. He's going to be like, no, I don't feel like turning myself into the cops.
That is really hard, and it's frustrating because what I would love to see is them the Springfield ecclesia. I would love to see them address this, and I'm not saying that like I not everybody there, of course, is a evil person, and I
I'm
know
sure,
that there's a
yes.
lot of lovely people. There are lovely people that I know and I care about who still attend, but uh, this this can happen again, and there
Yeah.
needs to be some accountability. There needs to be an acknowledgement of what happened, and if they could at least just address the Gary thing, like have guidelines for who can lead our youth group and like put it
Yeah.
on the website.
Are you going to
Like,
have background checks and say, due to past incidents that have happened, we have consulted officials who are trained in this, who are not freaking Christadelphians who don't know anything about it, who Googled it, but actual people who can advise us. And these are the things we can put in place. So, we've contracted with a company to make sure that we do background checks regularly. We're
I
making
love
sure that we
that.
have
That would be
video
great.
cameras, in the youth group rooms. We make sure that
Mm,
there's no women riding alone with an adult. You have to have two adults or something like that. Whatever
yeah,
it is, or regular like welfare checkups where it's like, hey, we're actually going to talk to you one-on-one. Just make sure you're okay if there's anything you need to talk about. Like where you have
I love
some
that.
things in place. Yeah, like have like counselors and stuff who are, where it's like a non-Christadelphian you can talk to be like, hey, if you ever have an issue, like we just have this as part of our thing because we want to make sure you have good mental health, but also if there's anything you talk about that you can't talk about with an adult that's a Christadelphian, talk about it with this person, just like the guidance counselor at school. But like even in the article, it talked about how they're encouraged not to talk to people outside the Christadelphians. They make it so you have nowhere where you can go to get help, and you don't even know what's out there. Even it was eye-opening to me when I needed resources and they were given to me, and I didn't even know they had existed. And I was in my 20s. Talk about a 12-year-old little girl who doesn't know. I didn't even know as a
Ugh,
grown woman. And again, a lot of that comes from this culture where we're sheltered and isolated, and then you're thrown all this abuse, and it's really hard. And so it would be better if the adults were proactive in offering it, making
right?
you aware, have the education, opening up connections, opening up communication, providing resources, knowing what you can do in situations, having the language to describe what's happening, sex ed. If you touched you where, we need to know what the words for these places are, what's going on.
Yeah.
Just to understand these things about consent, that no one can touch you there without your permission. If they do, you need to go to the police. Like, they need to know that, because, it sounds like these girls didn't report these crimes until potentially the police investigated. And it did not
Yeah.
say the nature of that, of like, oh, the parents passed it along, or, oh, like we pulled all the kids aside to check to see if he was assaulting children in the ecclesia. Like, I don't know how, but they found 3. So that's alarmingly high. And it makes me think either the girls didn't go to their parents, or they went to their parents or a trusted adult and were shut down.
That definitely happened for sure.
Either option is unacceptable. They need a trusted adult. And if they can't be trusted in this church community, who can they trust? That's supposed to be the safe, holy, wonderful
And
thing.
you feel that as a child, like that these people should be trusted adults, and that they are there for your best interest.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I know one of Roger's victims told a trusted Christadelphian adult about his abuse, and she was shut down and ignored. And then
That
another
makes me
incident I have heard
furious.
about. Yeah, and that the other incident was in the 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
It it was happening
Yep.
in the
Yep.
80s. In the 70s
Yep.
actually was that situation, I think,
Yep.
with my other cousin. And
Mm-hmm.
then it was happening again in the 2000s. This needs to be addressed.
Yeah, it is a pattern of behavior if it's going on decades. And again, that there's like, I went to their website and there was nothing on it. Like, hey, we no, we have some problems, we're working to address it. There was nothing proactive. Instead, it was that fluffy nonsense about how they're doing so much good in the world. And I'm just like,
And people are getting baptized
that's ridiculous.
daily.
Oh yeah, every day with our ecclesia of like 40 people.
There's not 40 people anymore.
There shouldn't be. There shouldn't be any
kids,
at that point. I'm sad
these
for everyone
kids
who has to
that
go.
were, yeah. I mean, I know, like, I have family that still go, and I know that they feel bad. Like, they remember in the 80s when
The 80s
there
were pretty
was
bad, I'm just gonna say.
50 people. Yeah, they were.
Yeah, people got out. That was the message, was get out while you can.
And a lot of those young kids from that era, they're gone.
Why do you think
Like,
they left?
what? Yeah, why do you
They
think they left?
Yeah, like this is what
Why?
they grew up with. They were smart. I can only imagine the level of indoctrination to get people to stay and to mentally suppress their natural instincts to be like, this is dangerous, this is toxic,
That's
this is
exactly what
harmful to
it
children, it's
is.
abusive. And their conditioning ran so deep that they're like, I shouldn't leave. I'm just gonna like justify it, suppress it, whatever it is that they're doing in their head, that cognitive dissonance, to not react to it, where they've dulled their own protection.
They do, and they forget.
Oh,
They force themselves to forget.
yeah, we're just
Yeah,
focusing on the
yeah.
future, on the kingdom. That's what's important. Jesus is coming any day now. And I was like, yeah, you've been saying that for how many decades now? How many generations now? Robert Roberts said it was coming in his lifetime. He was sure of it. He's been dead how long? Come on. Like,
Yeah, the doomsday cults vibe just it
yeah.
rears its head every once in a while, doesn't
Every
it?
once in a while is it's every time I talk to my family, they're like, did you know it's the end of the world? I'm like, thanks. It's
Oh, yeah,
not. It wasn't the last time either.
like every little natural phenomenon that science can
The
explain or
earthquakes.
whatever. Like,
Yeah, so
yeah.
I guess it's a good time to mention one time I Googled something for this podcast research and it brought me to a Facebook group for like Christadelphian predictions, and they said the end of the world was going to be in like August, I think, of like next year, the year after, because of like the earthquakes, and they read in the Bible somewhere and they like calculated out. So we're going to do a big party probably whatever month that is, like I guess September of that year when it's not the fucking apocalypse, because it doesn't happen. Yeah, we'll have to celebrate because we're gonna make it through yet another failed Christadelphian prediction.
Oh, yeah. Oh. I'm gonna be there. Let's celebrate.
Yeah, we'll put it on our calendars. I just have to confirm the year because I was like, was it this year? Because like that would be a great time to premiere the podcast. But it was not this year. I double checked. So I think it might have been 2026. But it's always, just far enough away that you have time to focus on it and like hype it up in your head and be like, "Woo, it's coming!" And then it passes, and you're like, "Oh, damn it! Let's figure out a new date."
Oh, there's
So
gonna be some kind of like bombs that go off in the Middle East or something,
yeah,
and
that's gonna
start
be it this
talking about
time.
get Bible verses in your Facebook feed.
Well, yeah, the Iraq War was supposed to be it, Twin Towers was supposed to be it, and then war in Ukraine was supposed to be it, and then the war with Israel. And whatever the next war will be it again. Just come
So
on.
weird.
Every piece of news, they're like, this is it. I'm like, all right, just
This
have you ever noticed any patterns here? Have you ever had any moment to reflect? No. So I have a little bit more. I mean, I have one paragraph that I'd started writing out, which I think completely just summarizes what we were just talking about, because I knew at some
Okay.
point we'd kind of loop towards this kind of conversation where I think I would say that we both probably would agree that we're disgusted by Gary's actions and the fact that this is potentially further evidence of child sexual abuse within the Christadelphian community in general, and specifically the Springfield Christadelphian Ecclesia. So it's hard to believe that parents were bringing their children to this church, allegedly believing it would offer salvation for their children, but instead causing trauma to them when they had to face being molested, raped, and also realize not only was it done by a family member, but for those individuals mentioned recently in that last bit about the 3 girls, also a convicted serial killer. As far as I'm aware, the Ecclesia has never implemented any measures to protect children, has never paid for therapy or any sort of support for the victims, or even required background checks for adults interacting with children within ecclesial settings. So that covers a lot of what we just discussed. In the end, Gary was charged for murder, and despite confessing to multiple murders, he was only convicted of one. He received a 30-year to life sentence, and the book records on page 103 that, quote, the murder sentence would be the second longest imposed in Vermont since the elimination of the death penalty several years earlier, unquote. Unfortunately, he would not answer questions from the police or the families of the victims. He claimed to have amnesia and fragmented memory of the crimes he committed, which seems pretty fucking ironic since he had no problem recounting stories to Dana while he held her hostage in his vehicle and was sexually assaulting her. You know, seeing he was just a little piece of shit who threw up at the thought of being arrested for his crimes, which again seems to indicate that he knew he committed them and that it was going to be bad for him, but he couldn't even offer any closure to the families. It has been speculated that maybe Gary had trauma as a child, which may have initiated the chain reaction that led to these murders. But if that was the case, he should have done some fucking work on himself, as there's no excuse for violating and murdering innocent children, in my opinion. As it happens, Keturah and I have both experienced sexual assault as minors, and we've never murdered anyone, so I don't want to hear any excuses and sympathy for the perpetrator of these brutal crimes that potentially involved hours of torture and trauma on innocent children and young people who were completely fucking innocent. You know, one girl was abducted while riding her bike, another while walking home. These are just ordinary people attacked by a monster because that was what he wanted to do, and he made the choice. And he still believed he was a good
Yes.
person and was showing up to church believing that and being a fake. He did
Mhm.
die. If you listen to either of the podcasts, both of them were speculating about whether he was dead or not. So I do want to clarify this on our podcast episode. He did die in an Eddyville, Kentucky prison on November 26, 2023. You'll see that now listed on his Wikipedia page. They were speculating and apparently often posts and like information for another convicted felon kept popping up and people were getting confused. He is finally dead as of last year because we're recording in 2024. But previous to that, he was alive when the other podcast episodes were out about him, if you do choose to listen to those. So that's the ending of Gary's story, I guess. And for us, I think there's value in sharing these stories. I mean, we're aware that Christadelphians try to keep a very clean image and handle problematic situations internally. So these stories and other things, many other things, I'm sure, stay out of the news. If there's anything that I missed, you can send resources to our podcast. As you can see, for all of the ones I mentioned today, all of them have a reference. So if you have like a newspaper article or something, that's what we would prefer. But unfortunately, these are all real situations. So these indicate that not all adults in power and in an ecclesia can be trusted. And even the integrity of the founder of the religion is kind of suspect, as we started with here. So it's quite possible the Christadelphians were founded by a grave robber. So it's a fun fact to throw out at your next Thanksgiving dinner with your family. But even now, it's apparent that ecclesias have historically protected abusers. Just the example of the men in the Springfield ecclesia who are abusing and even murdering women and children, who are in positions of power and influence because of that Christadelphian hierarchy of men who were protecting men, is a problem. Christadelphian
Mhm.
leadership and their cultural traditions may also contribute to these situations arising because of that restricted and isolated nature of members who are not encouraged to seek resources from trained professionals outside of the community, such as the domestic violence that was reported to the ecclesia but was unresolved and escalated into a murder of a Christadelphian. Abuse, neglect, domestic violence, and other criminal behavior needs to be reported to the authorities. The victims should be able to live in a safe environment away from their abusers. I can only imagine the trauma the young women faced when being coerced to be around their abusers under the guise of a promise of eternal life and being forced to attend events at the ecclesia with these people. If this life sucks and I have to be around the asshole who raped me, why the hell would I want to spend eternity with that asshole?
Really?
Their logic makes no sense, and it's so tone deaf that even the feeble attempts the Christadelphians have finally started to make in just the last few years is still focused on retaining members, serving the organization's interests, and protecting themselves from lawsuits and liability. If your program is self-serving, it says a lot about your religion. If your program is self-serving, your members are right to leave and look out for themselves because you clearly haven't historically done that and are still only focused on retaining your own membership. So that brings me to the end of my notes. So, how do you think of our true crime episode?
Wow, I feel
Whew.
like I went through like a meat grinder at the beginning.
Well, we did talk about a lot of meat, all those organs.
There was a lot of organs.
There's a lot of organs. Is
Yeah, you know what? I think I'm gonna have some tofu tonight.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair, actually.
Yeah. That was really interesting to hear about our lovely Christadelphian founder and what he was doing
Yeah, no one
in
talks about that.
cemeteries.
I wasn't even sure where to
It's
put that when I
really
first read it because I was like, that doesn't really fit in
wild.
with like the background history of him. But then when I started doing this, I was like, wait a second, I know about a grave robber or potential alleged grave robber, we'll say, because I can't prove it, but I'm highly suspect.
What I think my favorite part of that story was the clairvoyant lady that
Yeah,
had the
the
connection to
psychic.
Lincoln. I think she's like the hero of that story.
She was another woman who came in who was a badass and was like, "Yeah, I'm gonna help you out. I'm gonna help this young 16-year-old girl's spirit. She's gonna tell me where she was taken
Absolutely.
to." And I was like, "Yeah, let's see these women leading the stories." And that was
Hmm.
honestly what's interesting. We will do an episode on spiritualism, which I'm very excited about, but spiritualism at its initial founding was so tied up with the feminist movement. And so, what's interesting is when you look at spiritualist history, you see the beginning of feminism in America and its rise. And a lot of people try to edit that out of
Interesting.
the history, but like famous feminist activists would be in spiritualist meetings and being around spiritualists frequently. The movements were completely tied together, although the present day spiritualist movement does not have like a political agenda. They're kind of politically neutral, but in the beginning they were actually very close with activists. And it was one of the ways that women were able to get power because they were able to like go on stage and be like, "Oh, the spirit of this man
Yeah.
is talking through me," but like it's this woman on stage. And so it was able to help them break through gender norms
Oh,
of the day and to change how people were thinking about things and women's
yeah.
roles. So that's why it
Interesting.
was
That's really
nowadays it is
cool.
just considered a religion, but back in the day it was where there was a lot of activists and that was where a lot of mediums kind of gained power and that was they kind of started like creating this organization together that became the spiritualist church. So it's a really wild story.
That's really
Yeah.
that's
It's
interesting.
cool. So yeah, there's still some stigma, depending on who you talk to, believe me, around like mediumship, ghosts, afterlife kind of things. Certainly a lot of nonsense out there with plenty of psychics. Won't deny that. But at the same time, the history is wild, and there's enough there that it is a religion. It's still alive, and it's gonna be a
Oh,
fun episode.
I can't wait for that.
I do just love the feminist history of it as well.
There's a favorite book of mine for a couple reasons, but
Yeah.
it's called crap. Um
Your favorite book. Never heard
Shoot!
of it.
Oh my God! Oh
You're
my
just like,
God!
what
I
was it
don't own it anymore. I gave it to
called?
somebody, and it's something like how
Okay.
lesbians were such a big part of the suffragist movement and the activism,
I
the
believe it. Yeah.
abolitionist movement, things like
Yep.
that. They really they were the ones who spearheaded like the weekend and stuff that
Yeah. That's
the
awesome.
things that we take for granted now. I'm gonna find it. I'm gonna send you a link to it because it's really good.
Oh yeah,
So
absolutely.
good.
That sounds like something I would enjoy reading. And I could definitely see that because there's a book that I'll reference in my episode that's really good on like gender stuff that I would recommend for people interested in feminist theory that I'll share then. But learning about feminism when they looked at an analysis of all the ways that like patriarchy interacts with women, basically every impact was negative of having a man in your life, more likely to get killed by a man, and all that kind of stuff.
It's so
But
true.
the only positive was if you got married, there was financial benefits. You get tax breaks. Just for an example, they tend to be more income earners when you think about men generally earning more than women. If you have a man in the household earning, more likely to have more money than if you have two women living together making money. And so you just look at it from a
Not in this
financial
house.
aspect. Historically,
Yeah.
generations back, that was kind of how it went. You couldn't open your own bank account until like the 1970s in America as a woman. So you
Good
couldn't get like a
God.
credit card until even after that. And so you did not have access to full financial independence. You were really restricted by not having a man. So I totally believe that they would be passionate about it as someone who does not want the option of having a man in the house. They'd be like, well, we want the benefits that men have without having to actually deal with them. So,
Yeah.
well,
That's awesome.
I appreciate you coming on the podcast. I hope you enjoyed hearing the stories. It was fun to tell someone about it and get the live reaction. Thank you for also sharing your stories, opinions, and all of that related to the stories you were familiar with, and sharing the resources so that I could add in information about Roger, who never knew, never want to know. So I do appreciate you helped make
Same.
this episode what it is.
Oh, it's so wild.
I'm not happy about abuse, and so I'm not afraid to be upset about it and express that.
No, I think it's good. Yeah, let it
because
out.
apparently
Let
the
people hear
Christadelphians
it.
aren't going to talk about it, so
No,
ex-Christadelphians are
they're
going to
not.
talk about it. If you have experienced abuse, please contact your local authorities. Most places there's no restriction on when you can report it, and so you should look into that. If you do that, have support. Let a friend or someone else know, or have a cuddly animal ready when you get home to help you, because it's not fun. But you should absolutely report that kind of thing, and anything you can do to help people who've been through that is a good thing to do.
Don't let anybody silence you.
Yeah, we're finally reclaiming our voices here, sharing our truth, and connecting and building a community here. So thank you all for everyone who's tuned in. And hopefully this will be our only true crime episode, but if you have more, just email me and we'll look into it. Maybe we'll do a part 2 if we can justify it. All right. Thank you. This is the Life After Leaving podcast. See you next time. Thank you to everyone who has helped make this podcast possible. Today, I'd like to thank Heather for editing this episode, Al Kroons for creating our intro music, and the ex-Christadelphians that submitted audio for the intro music. If you'd like to join our community, you can find us on the group for ex-Christadelphians on Facebook. Or if you'd like to come on the podcast, reach out to me at lifeafterleavingpodcast@gmail.com. If you're enjoying this podcast, please consider leaving a rating and review or sharing this podcast with a friend. That's all for today. See you next time.